And it's a pleasure to bring an update on Alimera Sciences. For those of you who are not familiar with our company, we're based in Atlanta, Georgia, focused on the disease in the retina, specifically diabetic macular edema, and at this point in time, primarily on our drug Iluvien for the treatment of DME. We are currently commercially available in the US, the UK, Germany, and Portugal. When one speaks of DME, it's kind of interesting. As we step back now, we've had a few years to look at the paradigm and standard of care. We treat DME unlike most specialties that we see where there's chronic disease. It's a stark contrast in what we do in injecting boluses of drug every 1, 2, or 3 months, a very high patient burden, intermittent therapy, versus our peers in other specialties such as hypertension, diabetes, and arthritis. We don't tell a patient to take their medication only when their blood pressure goes up. We don't tell the diabetic to turn their pump on and off as their glucose measures move up and down. And yet, because we've been limited at what we've had available in diabetic macular edema, we're left with these sort of intermittent pulsating standard of care, which we certainly think can be improved on. Obviously, we believe Iluvien does that. This is the only drug available where you can treat the patient on a daily dose of steroid, a microdose continuous therapy, if you will, over 3 years. We do this through our delivery technology that is a polyimide tube of about 3.5 millimeters in length. One end of the tube is capped with a silicone cap, and no Iluvien is allowed to be immersed out. The other end is a polyvalent alcohol membrane, which allows the fluid dynamics and the hydration of a PVA matrix in the center, which contains 190 micrograms of fluocinolone acetonide. This allows us to inject 1 Iluvien and provide therapy 0.2 micrograms per day over a 3-year period. I don't think there's a lot of debate as to what are we trying to do in DME. I think we get consensus fairly quickly around 3 common goals. We want to dry the macula. We want to preserve vision at least, and in most cases we now believe we can improve patients' vision over the last few years of development. And then certainly we want to reduce the patient burden. I think the first 2 goals that I've shown up here are fairly commonly discussed. I think we have a lot of data that we're seeing constantly, panel discussions, peer-reviewed journals on how do we continually think about efficacy as it relates to treating the macula and preserving visual benefit. The third seems to get tabled because I think, quite frankly, most of the industry and most of the retinal community has just considered there's just no other option. We're stuck with these sort of intermittent therapies that we've had for the last few years. And when you consider that we've got 65 million Americans coming through the system and the growth of diabetes, I think it's no coincidence that we've heard so much this morning, and we'll continue to hear, I'm sure, after me, about the need for sustainability and sustained release to reduce this burden, not only for the patient, but for the system and the way logistics work in the office. We cannot continue to look at sticking needles in the eye. And if you look at the development programs out, a large majority of them still administer through injections. Recent studies show that patients take about 4.5 hours out of their day to go get an injection. 71% of them have caregivers, as you might suspect. That takes about 6.3 hours of the day of the caregiver. So basically we have caregivers, daughters, sons, husbands, taking a day off work to take these people into the offices. It's just simply not sustainable. We believe we have an answer to that in that Iluvien on the right of your screen is a constant low dose, and you can see the OCT measurement over 3 years versus the pulsing therapy that we see in some of the short-acting agents, and certainly we think that continuous microdosing is the way of the future. We have to concede, though, that steroids, and I know that's been discussed a little earlier here, steroids as a class does carry a bit of a reputation for intraocular pressure rise, and certainly that has been the case with large boluses of steroid, large injections. But I'm here to say one thing, I guess, and nothing else. This is not your father's steroid. This is by far the lowest dose of a daily steroid over the longest period of time that's available in ophthalmology. And as a result of that, we think the mitigation of the IOP side effect is greatly reduced. I get to speak to a lot of doctors and a lot of retinal specialists over the course of my job and over time. And I always ask them what I admit is a hypothetical question. I say, understanding the DRCR data in Protocol I and Protocol T, where it's consistently showing that monotherapy of anti-VEGFs in as little as 25% to maybe 40% is just not sufficient in monotherapy. If you could reduce the concern about IOP, would you not consider a base therapy of a more continuous low-dose steroid, maybe in monotherapy, but perhaps in combination with with that therapy. As you can imagine, I get a pretty positive response, but they always remind me, Dan, that's hypothetical. We don't know that. And I think today I can be happy to tell you that at our recent Euroretina meeting in Copenhagen last month, 2 sets of data were presented that makes this much less hypothetical in nature. The first is the Metasoft data, which is an electronic medical record system within the UK system that many hospitals use. The second is the IRIS data, which was a study mandated by the MHRA upon approval of Iluvien in the EU. If you notice in the second column, these are large N's. The statistical sample is very high, almost approaches the same number that was in our clinical trial. And if you go to the third column, you can see we've almost got 2 years, in some cases more than 2 years, worth of follow-up for these patients over time. And I'll bring your attention to this item D on both studies. In those patients, over the 2-year period treating in both of these studies, there was virtually no incisional surgery associated with IOP. And in fact, maybe more importantly, in the top study, 5 out of 6 patients had no treatment therapeutically for IOP, and 4 out of 5 patients in the second trial. So again, we're finding in real life the management of IOP is a much less concerning issue. I'm happy to tell you also, if you can attend Sunday, a luncheon that we were having, a lunch symposium where you'll see U.S. experience presented by doctors. And if you come by our booth, you'll get a chance to see where that is and at the time. Finally, from a financial standpoint, we're very excited about the growth we saw. This is translating now into real life sales, 60+% growth quarter over quarter, both from the EU and from the U.S. We've continued to lower our cash burn on a quarterly basis. With now $42 million in cash, we think we have ample runway to profitability the first half of next year. We'll begin to look at expanded indications for Iluvien and RVO potentially and non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll visit us at our booth. Thank you.